Good morning, and I thank the Commission for inviting us here to testify this morning. This is a topic that the United States takes very seriously. As President Obama said last year, when 1 in 3 Native American women will be raped in their lifetimes, it is an assault on our national conscience, and it's something that we cannot allow to continue. We're very pleased that the Commission is focusing on this issue today and that we have an opportunity to discuss our efforts to ensure safety for Native women. I'm particularly honored to be able to appear along with the petitioners, who I know to be tireless advocates in this work and who I consider to be allies in our shared efforts to ensure safety for Native women. As you've heard from the petitioners, violence against Native women in the U.S. has reached epidemic rates. The Department of Justice has heard from tribal leaders, police officers, and prosecutors about an all too familiar pattern of escalating violence that goes unaddressed in tribal communities, with beating after beating, each more severe than the last, ultimately leading to death or severe physical injury for too many Native women. We recognize that something must be done to address this cycle of violence. As you've heard from the petitioners, in the United States, law enforcement on tribal lands is a shared responsibility. Whereas crimes of violence against women are generally the purview of state and local governments in the United States, the federal government plays a heightened role in Indian country, and we often have the primary responsibility for investigating and prosecuting felony crimes. Under Attorney General Eric Holder's leadership, the Department of Justice has placed a high priority on combating violence against women in tribal communities. We know that addressing the serious criminal justice issues in tribal communities requires a true partnership. Increased consultation has been central to Attorney General Holder's approach to working with tribal nations. In October of 2009, the Attorney General convened a Tribal Nations listening session. Nearly 300 tribal leaders attended the session, which focused specifically on how we can work together to address violence against Native women. As a result of these consultations, the Department has implemented a host of reforms and new initiatives aimed at improving the federal government's response to crimes of violence against women in Indian country. In January of 2010, the Deputy Attorney General issued a directive to every United States attorney telling them to work closely with law enforcement to prioritize crimes of violence against women in Indian country. The U.S. attorneys were also directed to engage at least annually in consultation with the tribes and their districts to develop operational plans for addressing public safety in Indian country. In addition, the Department has deployed 28 new federal prosecutors whose sole mission is to prosecute crime in Indian country. We've also created a Violence Against Women Federal Tribal Prosecution Task Force. The task force membership includes both federal and tribal prosecutors, and the task force is currently assisting the Department in the development of best practice recommendations and resource materials concerning the prosecution of violence against women crimes in Indian country. The Department has also increased our support for tribal governments in their efforts to address violence against women in their communities by, among other things, establishing new domestic violence training programs for law enforcement officials and prosecutors, creating a streamlined process for tribes to access Department of Justice grant funds for public safety purposes. Through this streamlined process, we have awarded approximately $120 million to Indian tribes in each of the past 2 years for public safety purposes. This includes over $50 million a year to tribal governments through the Office on Violence Against Women. We're also working to establish a national clearinghouse specifically focused on the sexual assault of Native women and have funded a project to address some of the unique issues of collecting and preserving sexual assault evidence in rural and geographically isolated tribal communities. This innovative project focuses on using community-based lay healthcare providers, midwives, traditional medicine people, and community health aides to assist in collecting and preserving forensic evidence. We are confident that our efforts will make a real difference in the lives of Native women, but we know that much more needs to be done. In anticipation of this year's reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which is the key piece of federal legislation addressing all crimes of violence against women, we've been engaged in comprehensive discussions, including formal government-to-government consultations with Indian nations about how best to protect the safety of Native women. As a result of these consultations, the Department of Justice formally transmitted a proposal to Congress last July that we believe would address several major gaps in the current jurisdictional framework in the United States. As you heard from the petitioners, For a host of reasons, the current legal structure for prosecuting violence against women crimes in Indian country is simply not working. We know that tribal governments, tribal police, tribal prosecutors, and courts must be an essential part of the response to these crimes. But under current law, they lack the authority to address many of them. Tribal police officers who respond to a domestic violence call involving a non-Indian perpetrator often mistakenly believe that they cannot even make an arrest. Not surprisingly, abusers who are not arrested are more likely to repeat and escalate their attacks. Research shows that law enforcement's failure to arrest and prosecute abusers both emboldens attackers and deters victims from reporting future incidents. In short, the jurisdictional framework has left many serious acts of violence against Native women unprosecuted and unpunished. The Department of Justice is therefore asking Congress to consider several proposals to address these issues. First, recognizing that tribal nations with sufficient resources and authority will be best able to address violence in their own communities, our proposal would recognize tribal criminal jurisdiction to investigate, prosecute, convict, and sentence both Indians and non-Indians who assault Indian spouses, intimate partners, or dating partners, or who violate orders of protection in Indian country. We recognize that expanding tribal criminal jurisdiction to cover more perpetrators of violence against women will tax the already scarce resources of most tribes. Therefore, we've proposed that new legislation also authorize grants to support tribes in strengthening their criminal justice systems. We've also proposed legislation that would clarify that tribal courts have full civil jurisdiction to issue and enforce protection orders against both Indians and non-Indians. And finally, we recognize that in general, federal criminal law has not developed over time in the same manner as state criminal laws in the United States, which have long recognized the need for escalating responses to specific acts of domestic and dating violence. We have therefore proposed amendments to the Federal Criminal Code that would provide a series of graduated sanctions that would ensure that perpetrators would be subject to similar potential punishments regardless of where they commit their crimes. We believe that these changes in federal law will complement our ongoing efforts and significantly improve the safety of women in tribal communities by allowing federal and tribal law enforcement agencies to hold more perpetrators of violence against women accountable for their crimes.